Harlem, 144th Street. A line is forming, not a line outside a club, not a line outside a store on a Saturday morning, a line of people from every borough of New York City who have made a specific trip to this specific block on this specific day because there is something on 144th Street that cannot be found anywhere else in the city. The operation running on this block is generating $1 million per week. On a bad day, not a good week, not an exceptional month, not a record-breaking quarter, a bad day, $1 million per week on a bad day. And the man responsible for all of it, the man who built the organizational architecture that turned one Harlem block into the most profitable operation in New York City, is somewhere in this neighborhood right now. You cannot find him, not because he is hiding, because he built his operation with 3 layers of insulation between himself and anyone trying to reach him. You would need to go through 3 separate people before you even got close to the man in charge. And even if you got through all 3, you still might not know which man in that circle was actually running everything, because everyone around him looked like a boss. Fly, fresh, paid. All of them. Every single person in his organization carried themselves with the specific presentation that the man at the top demanded. Not because he wanted confusion, because he understood that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was be the only person in the room who looked like he had money. His name was Brooks Davis. The streets called him Sickle. And this is the story of the man who made $1 million a week on a bad day in Harlem while making sure nobody could find him. Harlem in the crack era was producing operators at a speed that the legitimate economy could not absorb. Young men who understood supply and demand before they understood anything else, who saw the specific mathematics of what was available to them and made calculations that the neighborhood could not argue with. Brooks Davis was not one of those men. He was something different. He came up in the golden era of Harlem's underground economy, the specific intersection of the heroin era and the crack era, where the men who survived were not the reckless ones, but the calculated ones. The men who lasted were not the loudest, not the most violent, not the ones who announced themselves with the specific performance of power that most young men in that world mistook for actual power. The men who lasted were the ones who built systems. He entered the game young, smart, ambitious, but the quality that separated him from every other ambitious young man in Harlem was the one quality that the street almost never produces: patience. He was not chasing fast money. He was building structure. He understood from the beginning, before most men in his position ever understood it at all, that the difference between a man who gets money and a man who builds something was not the product, not the connect, not the territory. It was the organization, the system that kept running when you were not there, the specific architecture of trust and discipline and role clarity that allowed an operation to function at scale without its leader being present for every transaction. The invisible infrastructure that most operators never built because they were too focused on the transaction in front of them to think about the system behind it. He studied how the successful men around him operated, not the ones who made money for 2 years and then disappeared into the federal system. The ones who lasted, the ones whose organizations kept generating even when the heat came, the ones whose names carried weight across multiple boroughs, not because of a single spectacular moment, but because of years of consistent, disciplined, systematic operation. He observed, he absorbed, he applied, he focused on controlling the flow, not the hand-to-hand, not the individual transaction that most operators thought of as the business. The flow, the invisible current of money and product moving through a system that he designed and built and maintained, the way an engineer maintains infrastructure, not by doing the work himself, but by making sure the system worked without him. By the time he was done building, 144th Street was not a corner operation. It was a gold mine. 144th Street, one block in Harlem. The people who came to that block came from everywhere, not just the neighborhood, not just uptown. Every borough of New York City sending people to 144th Street because what was available there could not be found anywhere else. The product on this block was not cut to the margins that maximized dealer profit. It was not stretched or diluted or reduced to the standard purity that most of New York's underground market had accepted as the norm. It was real, and real was what people traveled for. The lines that formed on 144th Street were not the lines of a neighborhood operation serving local demand. They were the lines of a distribution hub, the specific geography that emerges when word spreads across a city that one location has something everyone else is missing. Queens was sending people, Brooklyn was sending people, the Bronx was sending people, all of them making the specific trip to Harlem to 144th Street because what was on that block was worth the journey. The money moved so fast, it was not counted in stacks. It was counted in systems. Think about what that sentence means. When you count money in stacks, you count by denomination, by bundle, by the specific physical organization of cash that most people associate with large amounts of money. Stacks are what you count when you have a lot. Systems are what you count when you have so much that stacks are not efficient. When the cash coming in is arriving faster than it can be physically organized into stacks. When the volume is so large that the counting process itself requires its own organizational infrastructure, you are no longer running a corner operation. You are running a business, $1 million per week. On a bad day, not a good week, not an exceptional month, not a record-breaking quarter that the organization pointed to as its peak. A bad day, $1 million per week was what the operation generated when things were slow, when the traffic was lighter than usual, when the specific variables that affect any business were not working in the organization's favor. On a good week, the number was something else entirely. To understand what $1 million per week meant in the context of the crack era in Harlem, consider the men who were generating those kinds of numbers across New York City at that time. The names that ended up on federal indictments, the organizations that generated the specific law enforcement attention that comes when the money gets big enough. Those men were known. Their names traveled. Their stories became the oral history that hip-hop eventually put on wax. Brooks Davis generated $1 million per week on a bad day. And Harlem never said his name. That is the specific impossible contradiction at the center of his story. Not the money, the invisibility, because the money was extraordinary, but the invisibility at that scale, the specific ability to generate $1 million per week on a bad day while remaining unknown outside the 3 blocks surrounding 144th Street, that was the achievement. That was what separated Brooks Davis from every other operator in his era. 3 layers. That was the specific insulation between Brooks Davis and anyone trying to reach him. You could not call him. You went through a person who went through a person who went through a person, and at the end of that chain, if the chain held, maybe you got access to the man in charge. Maybe, because even if you got through all 3 layers, you would walk into a room full of men who all looked exactly the same. Fly, fresh, paid. Brooks Davis demanded it, not of himself alone, of everyone in his circle. Every person associated with his operation carried themselves with the specific presentation that his organization required. Custom chains, heavy rings, the specific uniform of a man who had built something real. All of them. So when you finally got through those 3 layers and arrived at wherever Brooks Davis was, you looked around the room and you could not tell which man was actually in charge. That was deliberate. It was not vanity. It was not the specific performance of wealth that most operators use to announce their position. It was operational security in the form of presentation. If every man in the room looks equally powerful, the man you are trying to identify is protected by his own organization's appearance. The whole crew was bossed up, and Sickle was somewhere inside that. The mink suit. That detail tells you everything about who Brooks Davis was outside the organizational architecture. Full mink. Not a mink coat, not a mink jacket, a mink suit, including the pants. In Harlem in the 1980s, where the specific fashion of the crack era was already producing extraordinary visible wealth, a full mink suit, including pants, was a statement that existed in its own category. He wore double rollies, 2 Rolex watches, 1 on each wrist, the specific extravagance of a man who had decided that one was not enough, not because he needed to check the time twice, but because the weight of 2 Rolexes on 2 wrists communicated something specific about what he had built. Custom chains, heavy rings, ankle bracelets. The young men on the block would wait specifically to see which car he pulled up in that day. Not to see him, to see the car, because the car changed. Every day, a different car pulled up on 144th Street. The specific anticipation of which one, the specific variety of what Brooks Davis might arrive in on any given afternoon, was its own kind of entertainment for the neighborhood. He hosted community events. He gave back. The specific presence of a man who had built something real in a neighborhood, who understood that the relationship between an operator and his community was not adversarial but mutual, was visible in how Harlem related to Brooks Davis. He was not feared, he was respected. There is a difference. Fear produces compliance. Respect produces loyalty. And loyalty, the specific loyalty of a community that has watched a man build something and give back from what he built, is what maintained the organizational discipline of 144th Street even when the pressure was rising. He moved money out of the streets and into the legitimate world, not sloppily, not in the way that most operators move money, converting cash into cars and jewelry that could be seized, into assets that announced their origin to anyone paying attention. Strategically, he understood something that most men in his position never fully grasped until it was too late. The government does not only come for what you have, it comes for what you cannot explain. The specific liability of the underground economy is not the operation itself. It is the gap between what you visibly have and what you can legitimately account for. Tax evasion took Al Capone. Money laundering took more of the men who followed. Brooks Davis built a different kind of operation. Restaurants, real businesses, with real customers, with real revenue flowing through real registers. The specific infrastructure of food service, the cash-intensive, high-volume, daily transaction nature of a restaurant provided the perfect vehicle for moving money from one world to the other. High-end jewelry stores in the Diamond District. The specific geography of Midtown Manhattan, where legitimate diamond and jewelry businesses operated, and where a man with cash could build a presence that generated legitimate-looking revenue while also providing the specific infrastructure for converting one form of wealth into another. Real estate. The most reliable wealth-building tool in American history. the specific asset class that converts cash into something that generates income, appreciates in value, and provides a documented paper trail of legitimate wealth accumulation. His own fish store, not glamorous, not the kind of business that anyone would associate with a man who was generating $1 million per week on a bad day. But that was exactly the point. A fish store in Harlem, a neighborhood business serving the community, was the specific kind of legitimate operation that generated enough daily cash to absorb money moving from elsewhere without raising the questions that a more conspicuous business would invite. Each business was real. Each business generated real revenue from real customers. And each business also provided the specific infrastructure that allowed money to move from the underground economy into the legitimate world with enough layers between the origin and the destination to make the journey difficult to trace. He was thinking about the long game, the specific long-term thinking of a man who understood that the street was a starting point, not a destination, that the money generated on 144th Street was not the end of the story, but the capital for a story that extended into the legitimate world. The Diamond District, the fish store, the restaurants, the real estate. Each business was chosen deliberately, not randomly, not because the opportunity presented itself, but because each one served a specific function in the larger architecture of what Brooks Davis was building. The jewelry stores in the Diamond District gave him access to one of the most cash-intensive, legitimate businesses in New York City. The diamond trade runs on cash, always has. The specific culture of Midtown's jewelry district, where transactions happen in person, where cash changes hands in volumes that would trigger suspicion in any other context, made it the ideal environment for a man who needed to move cash from underground to legitimate without creating obvious fingerprints. The fish store was something different entirely, not glamorous, not the kind of business that announces wealth or status or the specific success that Brooks Davis had built on 144th Street, just a fish store. The kind of neighborhood business that everyone uses, nobody pays much attention to, and that generates enough daily cash transactions that the money moving through it is difficult to distinguish from the money coming into it. The restaurants served the same function with the added benefit of being community anchors, places that employed people, that served the neighborhood. That gave Brooks Davis a visible, legitimate presence in Harlem that was completely consistent with the community investment he was already making through the events he hosted and the support he provided. The real estate was the long game, property that generated income regardless of what happened on 144th Street. That could not be spent in a single bad night. That would still be there when everything else was gone. That was not a man who was going to spend everything he made and end up with nothing when the end came. That was a man who was building something that could survive the end. It ended the way it always ends, not from outside, from inside. The federal investigation that eventually dismantled what Brooks Davis had built on 144th Street did not begin with surveillance of Brooks Davis. It did not begin with a wiretap on his phone, or a camera on his block, or a confidential informant who had been watching from the outside. It began with someone who knew the operation from inside, someone who had been through all 3 layers of insulation. Who knew which man in that room full of equally dressed, equally paid, equally presented men was actually running everything? Who had the specific access that only comes from being genuinely trusted by the organization, from being inside the circle that Brooks Davis had spent years building and protecting? That person talked. One conversation, one decision made in the specific moment when the pressure of what they were facing felt heavier than the loyalty they had built over years. 25 years of work. That is what one conversation cost. The federal investigation targeted the conspiracy operating around 143rd and 144th Streets. The specific legal architecture of a federal conspiracy charge that allows the government to connect everyone inside an organization to the same indictment, from the man running the operation to the man holding the product on the corner, through the simple fact of knowing and participating. The layers of insulation that had kept Brooks Davis invisible, the three people between him and anyone trying to reach him, the room full of men who all looked equally powerful, could not survive an internal cooperator who had already been inside those layers. Someone who had already gotten through. Someone the government now owned. Brooks Davis was arrested. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. 25 years. For one block in Harlem. For $1 million per week on a bad day. For the most profitable single-block operation in New York City history. The government gave him 25 years. And here is what that sentence tells you about what he had built. 25 years is not a sentence the federal government gives to small operators. It is not a sentence for a man who is running a corner. It is not a sentence for someone who was caught with product and money, and nothing else. 25 years is a sentence for a man who built something that the federal government recognized as significant, who organized, managed, and directed an enterprise at a scale that the specific legal threshold of the kingpin statute was designed to address. The government's accounting of what Brooks Davis had built, translated into years at sentencing, was 25, and he served them, every single one. There is a photograph taken during a visit to Brooks Davis while he was incarcerated in a federal facility. In that photograph, in a prison visiting room, in the specific controlled environment where men serve the time the government has assigned them, Brooks Davis is wearing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. Not a single symbolic chain, not a modest piece that said, "I remember who I am." Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. In a federal prison visiting room, the man who wore double Raleighs and full mink suits and changed cars every day, so the neighborhood had something to look forward to, was still that man. In a prison visiting room, with the specific casual relationship to extraordinary wealth that a man develops when the wealth has been part of him long enough to become his natural state. The government had taken 25 years of his life. They could not take what he was. He came home after 25 years. He lives quietly now. No loud interviews, no documentaries with his face on camera, no specific media presence that would allow the world to attach an image to a name that most of the world never heard. Still in the shadows, still invisible the way he was always invisible, not because the world has forgotten him, but because he designed his life that way from the beginning. 3 layers between himself and anyone trying to reach him. A room full of men who all looked equally powerful. A presence so carefully managed that even the people watching could not always identify the man in charge. He is still seen in Harlem, wearing his legendary apple piece chain, the specific jewelry that became his signature, that the people who know him recognize the moment they see it, is still around his neck. He came home after 25 years and put the chain back on. Because some things do not change. Because a man who built what Brooks Davis built, who turned one Harlem block into $1 million per week, who moved through New York City with 3 layers of insulation between himself and everyone trying to find him, who sat in a federal prison visiting room wearing hundreds of thousands in jewelry, does not come home and become someone different. He comes home and becomes himself again. Brooks Sickle Davis, the man who turned one block into $1 million per week, the man who made sure 3 people stood between him and anyone trying to find him. The man who dressed his entire organization like bosses so nobody could tell which one was actually in charge. The man who moved street money into restaurants and jewelry stores and real estate and fish stores while Harlem watched his cars change every day. The man who served 25 years and came home to put his chain back on. Harlem never said his name loud, but Harlem always knew exactly who he was.